Find safe positions.
There are no safe positions.
Oh, there's one. Behind me.
It looks like it's about time I finally talk about Masters of the Universe Revelation, the new-ish Netflix anime from showrunner Kevin Smith and Powerhouse Animation. That's right, Masters of the Universe Revelation, the show that taught us all just how insufferable He-Man fans could truly be. Or maybe that was She-Ra. Have they always been this awful? Motu Revelation, which is what I'm going to call it for this video, is a He-Man show that on the surface appears to be an animated continuation of the cartoon from the 80s. The trailer heavily relied on people's nostalgia to get them invested, which in the long run was probably for the worse. Despite being heavily advertised one way, Revelation was actually something entirely different. Now, full spoilers here. For anyone looking to get into the show completely blind, it's kind of a difficult show to discuss without spoiling anything, which is why I've decided to just spoil it all anyway. But what this show is actually a more, I want to say, apocalyptic take on the world of Eternia, with He-Man immediately being killed off in the first episode and magic disappearing from the universe. The best way I could describe it is one of those later episodes of an action cartoon where a character goes missing and now everything is awful because of that. Some of the best examples I can think of include the 2003 Ninja Turtles episode, Same as It Never Was, or the Gargoyles episode, Future Tense. But at the same time, it's also not that. The first season of this show was actually released in 2 parts. At least I think it's the first season. The first half released in July of 2021, while the latter half released 4 months later in November. The first and second half of the show are actually quite different from one another, but I felt the need to watch the entirety of season 1 before really being able to write my thoughts on this thing. And now that I've seen the entirety of it, I can confirm that Motu Revelation is neither awful or great. It really is just a mixed bag of a show where for every great idea there was another that I wasn't exactly on board with. Now keep in mind, it's difficult for me to talk about Masters of the Universe from a critical eye, because even as someone who loves the series, I don't think there was ever a time when the series was at its peak. I think He-Man and the Masters of the Universe has always been kind of this dumb thing made to sell toys to little kids, and that's also exactly what I love about it.
Your evil mist won't make a slave of He-Man. Oh, yeah? One more blast of my hypnotizing mist, and now you're gonna see real power, Cobra Con.
In part 1 of the show, much of the focus is put on Teela, which for some reason was a big problem for a lot of people, which I never really understood, because I tend to find the appeal of Masters of the Universe to be the world rather than just one specific character. I had no idea people loved the character of specifically He-Man this much. But even with that statement, I can still see how some people were upset with Netflix's marketing team pretty much lying to their face. It was a pretty scummy thing to do, and I'm sure an example of Netflix being far more concerned with drawing in viewers rather than satisfying the fans. But let's be real, fans can be pretty spoiled too, especially in this day and age. Part 1 sees the events of what happens after He-Man dies and Adam's secret is out. None of the characters take this very well, so they all go off in their own way, and I remember this part just being kind of frustrating because not a single character tends to handle Adam's death in a mature manner.
Teela, get this disgraced man-at-arms out of my sight!
No. I am done with every one of you. Enough of your secrets and lies.
This is something they would end up addressing kind of in part 2, but it still left a sour taste in my mouth, especially considering the wait for the second half. I really felt the character writing was one of the weakest aspects of the show, which was a real shame considering that this is supposed to be the more mature take on He-Man. I know it says TV PG, but I'm pretty sure censors for Netflix don't bother watching past a single episode. Especially in part 2 when the show starts getting horny.
I'd sure like to fist him.
Teela's character for the first half of the show is pretty basic. It's mostly just her being angry over Adam lying about who he was, and it honestly feels kind of cold. She really seems to care more about his lies than the fact that he's dead. Andra was a new addition here, aiding Tila on her journey. Well, she was at least new to me. I am aware she originated from the Masters of the Universe Star comics, and maybe she's better developed there, but she never really felt like a well-defined character to me. It was like the writers didn't care enough to give her the time of day, which was really disappointing. The show may be for an older audience, but a lot of the ways that they went about that concept, I was not a fan of. To me, a lot of the dialogue felt very full of itself, like the writers thought they were writing Shakespeare and not a cartoon with characters named Fisto and Stinkor in it. One moment I really disliked early on was when Cringer gives this long speech about bravery, and it just feels super out of character for him.
I may have known Adam's big secret, sure, but Tila, you knew his heart. So ask yourself, what would Adam want you to do?
I feel the show does this thing a lot where it tries to say something with these characters, but it does so while creating dynamics that were never really there before, or at least was never part of the original show or comics, so whenever they bring up some character aspect like that, it just fell flat for me.
Till recently I didn't say much at all to you, as I was convinced you were an idiot. But now I realize you're the closest thing I have to a friend in my wretched life.
I think edgy might be the best word to describe how I felt about a lot of it. The show tended to over-explain a lot of things I never really questioned. Like, I never needed to know that Orko's name was supposed to be Oracle. That just felt like bad fanfiction to me.
But when you're little, some words are hard to pronounce. I said Orko when I really meant
Oracle. They called you Oracle.
Although I did love Orko here, I mean, I've always loved Orko, and Griffin Newman's take on the character, it was one of those castings that was just perfection, like perfect voice for him there. However, I did feel a lot of the performances here when it came to the voices was very hit or miss. Like, Chris Wood He-Man and Mark Hamill Skeletor were both great, but even though I love Sarah Michelle Gellar, I mean, who doesn't? Her voice as Tila just felt off to me, like it wasn't the right character for her.
The less people rely on magic, the better off we'll all be.
It's really hard to pin down why a voice performance does or doesn't work. It really is just based on the way you feel while listening to it. And I hear some people tend to say that Skeletor, being Mark Hamill, sounds too much like the Joker, but I don't see it. I felt that he gave a really great performance here.
Because while we are different in so many ways, we share one thing in common: our hatred of He-Man.
Now, Revelation is probably not the show that Mattel should have made at the point in time that they did. I believe a big problem with the first half of the show is based on the fact that there hasn't been a He-Man show in nearly 2 decades. The last one being the 2002 cartoon. 2 decades is a very long time, and if they wanted to bring back He-Man in a big way that would have excited older fans, they probably should have taken the safer, more nostalgic route. I appreciate them doing something risky with it though, but it's very easy to understand why people were upset with this new take on He-Man. I think Netflix and Mattel could have avoided a lot of that outrage had they made this more of a traditional He-Man story. You know, some big epic with He-Man facing off against Skeletor, mostly just carried by Powerhouse's incredible animation. It would have been a perfect way to appeal to both the old fans and introduce a new generation to the world of Eternia. The entirety of Revelation really feels like the later season of a show, which you could argue it is based on Kevin Smith's original claims, which really only adds to the confusion. When he was promoting the show, Kevin Smith would often refer to this as a direct sequel to the 1983 series, but it really isn't. The changes made are minor, but there's just too many of those minor changes for it to be a true sequel. This is definitely more of a reboot in my mind. I believe the biggest difference between this series and the original is just how competent Skeletor's henchmen appear to be. They're really not the same buffoons from the 80s cartoon.
Hey, everything's spinning. I can't see.
This isn't necessarily a bad thing for the type of story that this show is trying to tell, but it does kind of mess up the continuity and makes me wonder why they advertised it the way they did. The end of part 1 really is this roller coaster of emotions, with Tila and friends traveling to Preternia, which in this iteration is pretty much heaven, on their quest to bring back Prince Adam. Adam comes back to Eternia only to be stabbed in the back by Skeletor, who hid himself away in Evil Lynn's globe, waiting for the exact moment to strike and claim the Sword of Power for his own. This was the cliffhanger before part 2, and you can really see why some people may have been pissed off here, thinking that this was another so-called bait and switch. But the real bait and switch is that part 2 of Revelation is almost the show that fans were promised, with Prince Adam making his heroic return as He-Man. I enjoyed part 2 more than part 1. I think a lot of that really was based on the fact that there's a lot more focus on action than story here. Usually that would be the opposite of what I'd want out of a show, but Powerhouse being Powerhouse really deliver here. The animation is quite stunning at times, and the end battle is just as epic as it needs to be. And not to mention the fight scene where Prince Adam goes full on Barney Rubble and starts beating the shit out of Skeletor. I mean, that was tight. The whole reveal around the power always being within He-Man and the sword simply being a conduit is a fun idea that I found to be very messily executed. It felt weird that this was just always a thing and no one ever mentioned it before. It was very Deus Ex Machina, but then again, a lot of things that happen in part 2 are. Even then, sometimes I have to remind myself that I'm watching He-Man, and it doesn't really matter if something in it is stupid, because that's kind of half the fun of He-Man. I made it clear I wasn't really a fan of the writing of this show or the way that characters were handled. Part 2 really tried to delve into Evil Lynn's character more, but none of the new stuff they added to her really intrigued me. Like what? Her origin is her parents tried to eat her, so she ran to the sewers to live with rats? That's the best backstory they could come up with. This character has been around for nearly 40 years, and that's the best they could do. I did, however, enjoy Tila's arc with her becoming the new sorceress. It felt like the obvious direction for the series to take, and I felt it was handled better than a lot of her development as a character in part 1 was. The presence of both Prince Adam and Skeletor also brings this bit of a levity to part 2 that I really felt part 1 was missing. See why this would have been so much better had they just waited to release this all as one season? Like, Netflix could have avoided so much drama by doing so. Although I'm sure Netflix doesn't care. The only person being targeted here is Kevin Smith, and Kevin Smith's got money. Although I do not doubt that there's probably a lot of people now who just simply refuse to watch part 2 because they've already decided they have to hate this show and just refuse to budge. Like it's some kind of moral code to these people. Another minor complaint I have is there may just be too many characters in this show for its own good. There was so many characters who would appear for a few minutes just to be immediately taken out. Truly embarrassing. Although I suppose He-Man does have quite a lot of characters in it. I just wish that the ones they did decide to focus on had more to do as well. Like, Beastman had a lot of scenes in this, but he just felt completely wasted. I've actually complained about this show quite a bit, and it may sound like I hated it, but I was very much entertained by it. It truly was a roller coaster of emotions. I found Revelation to be a rather interesting series with stunning visuals, great action, and plenty of fun fan servicey moments, including a shit ton of 1987 movie references. And don't think for a second I didn't catch that Four Non-Blondes reference. Kevin Smith, I'm onto you, you motherfucker. For me, the writing is where the show stumbles, and unfortunately, that is the most important part. It could have been great, but what we got is just okay. On the internet, I only ever see people completely in love with this show or utterly despising it, and I'm just going to be that guy that kind of meets in the middle. I am definitely not trying to convince anyone to hate on this show. I'm much happier to see people enjoying it than I am to see this constant mob-like negativity that surrounds it. I feel it's worth checking out if you're already into He-Man, but I'd actually recommend the recent CG show for kids over this one. It definitely doesn't look like the old show, but I feel it better captures the essence of Masters of the Universe. But this one is perfectly fine too. I didn't feel like I wasted any time with it, so you make your own decision here. Thanks to everyone who watched this video, and remember, The power is yours. Oh, that's the wrong show.
Captain Planet, he's our hero.